So those of you that are here regularly know how much I love metaphors as a tool for teaching the Dharma. And so here comes another one this morning. And I want to talk about the metaphor of the crashing waves, because life, as we all know, is dynamic, it's unpredictable, and it can feel like an ocean. And within this ocean is our wandering attention, our reactive emotions, which form the crashing waves as they hit the shore. It's ceaseless, they're volatile, they're unrelenting, they rise and fall. Sometimes, they're gentle and they sort of just slap onto the shore. Other times they're crashing against the rocks. But they really represent in this metaphor the turbulence of our minds, the constant waves that we're dealing with internally. And it's this cycle of crashing waves, this cycle of distraction and reaction that really can perpetuate our suffering. And the good news is that some of the tools of the Dharma will help us sort of navigate the storms of these waves. And again, not by attempting to stop them, which is impossible as we know, but by learning to ride them with skill and awareness. Our wandering attention, just bouncing off everything, can be one of the primary causes of a general mental unrest. Sometimes in Buddhism we talk about this as the monkey mind, just our minds are just bouncing from one thing to the next. And, it may feel like that our thoughts jump from one thing to the next with little direction or control, and this often becomes apparent when we sit down to meditate. We'll sit down or try to focus on a task. Sometimes when I sit down to meditate, at least initially, I'm just bouncing all over the place. Our attention is, we evolved to have our attention go to whatever calls for it, okay? And so our attention can be pulled away by thoughts of the past, regrets, worries about the future, fleeting desires, cravings, on and on and on. And it creates an endless mental chatter, often driven by craving on the one hand, I want this, I want that, or aversion on the other hand, I don't want this, I don't want that. But either case, it prevents us rather from experiencing the fullness of the present moment. And this is where our mindfulness practice comes in so importantly, because it's a way to cultivate our attention, to anchor our wandering attention, to begin to learn to train the mind to be fully present in the moment. When the mind wanders during meditation, we very gently bring it back to the anchor, usually the breath, always without judgment, always without any self-criticism. We do this again and again, but we do it with patience, we do it with compassion. It's not unlike planting a flag in the ground in a raging windstorm, or like a port in the storm, to get back to our crashing wave analogy. But it's a steady point of focus in the midst of what is normally a fair amount of mental chaos. Because through our meditation, we learn to observe our thoughts. We become the observer of them without getting swept away by them. We remind ourselves that we are not our thoughts. We can just watch them arise, watch them pass away. And when we cultivate this practice, what it does is it creates a space, just a little bit of opening between the thought and our reaction to it. Normally, as soon as we think something, we react, just sort of hair trigger. And one of the beauties of this practice is the pause that's there once we begin to insert it into that space, that just really quick space between thought and action. And it can, and the reason this is so important is it can transform how we engage with the world. It allows us to respond with clarity, with discernment, rather than just a hair trigger, react out of habit and old patterns. Now, I don't need to tell you that just like the waves are shaped by the winds, on a calm day, they're pretty quiet. On a windy day, when we were down the beach in September, it was windy, they were just hammering the shore. But similarly, our emotions are often driven by external conditions akin to the waves. So for instance, a harsh word from a friend or a colleague, or a sudden disappointment, or even an unexpected joy can send our emotional waves just crashing in a more extreme fashion. And very often the these reactive emotions that we experience are fueled by one of the three poisons that the Buddha taught. Greed, which is clinging, I want it. Aversion, I don't want it, I don't like it. And delusion, seeing things not as they are, but as we wish them to be. I mean, I love the Buddha's notion of the three poisons because to me it encompasses so much of our experience and contributes to so much of our suffering. But the point is, when we allow these emotions to control us, we just become like a small boat being tossed on the waves, tossed in a storm. We can't really steer ourselves toward calm waters, and it can really cause suffering. And so one of the things that our practice helps us achieve and becomes a real antidote to this reactivity is the cultivation of equanimity. I always think of equanimity as being really grounded in the storm, really being steady in the midst of the storm. And this does not mean that we suppress our emotions. It does not mean we become detached from our emotions or detached from our lives. It means we learn to just stay grounded as we get hammered by them. So by developing a balanced mind through our practice, we weather the ups and downs, we weather the crashing waves with greater wisdom and with greater grace. The Buddha talked about, again, so brilliantly, the cultivated equanimity through the practice of what he called the four foundations of mindfulness, particularly mindfulness of our feelings. Okay, he talked about mindfulness of the body, mindfulness of feelings, mindfulness of our thoughts, mindfulness of our emotions. But by observing mindfulness of the feeling tones, or what he called the feeling tones, as they arise, without clinging on and grasping tightly pleasant sensations, or immediately reflexively pushing away unpleasant ones, we begin to see them for what they truly are. We see them as just passing phenomena. We don't become overly identified with them. We don't think they are us. We just think they are another form of experiences that we have. And this insight allows us to loosen the grip of these reactive patterns. Once we see that they're just passing phenomena, we put that little space between thought and response, we begin to approach life's challenges with greater resilience. Our wandering attention and reactive modes are deeply intertwined. They sort of feed each other in a continuous cycle. When our attention drifts, it often lands on thoughts or sensations that give rise to reactive emotions. So if my attention drifts and I'm thinking about an unpleasant encounter I had, I have an emotional response to that. It's just, and then from that, I just begin to perseverate. I just, begin to link all these other experiences to which I'm reactive, okay? And it can just be a constant source of distress and suffering. These emotions disrupt our focus. They pull us deeper into this cycle of dissatisfaction and reactivity. Breaking this cycle requires a twofold process. Cultivating focused attention through our meditation practice and developing emotional awareness through our insight practice, learning about ourselves, becoming students of our own emotional world. Okay. One of the ways that I found really beneficial in achieving this is practicing loving kindness meditation. It takes me out of myself, out of my ego. It directs thoughts of goodwill and compassion toward myself and others. It begins to train our mind to focus more on the wholesome and uplifting states rather than the negative, disparaging states. And it begins to loosen. Loving kindness helps loosen the grip of the reactive emotions such as anger and jealousy. Okay, we've talked, envy being another one we've talked about. Because by extending that out, and I used to be kind of a skeptic about loving kindness. I thought, well, it just sort of sounds like pop psychology or something. But it's a powerful practice once we begin to do it. I was really surprised when I began to do it more consistently, because it replaces those negative emotions with feelings of deeper connection, deeper compassion, and deeper understanding. And over time, the practice not only helps calm the crashing waves, but it transforms the underlying currents underneath the waves. The ocean of our minds will never be completely still. That's not the goal. It's not an achievable goal. These waves of wandering attention and reactive emotions will continue to arise as long as we're alive. But we don't need to fight them. We don't need to fear them. We learn to ride them skillfully using the teachings of the Dharma, some of which I've talked about a moment ago, as our guide. Mindfulness, equanimity, loving kindness. We develop the inner strength and clarity to navigate these storms with greater wisdom and compassion. Crashing waves are not our enemies. They are our teachers if we allow that. Waves remind us of the impermanent and interdependent nature of all things. Waves are temporary. They crash and then the next one comes, but they're all interdependent. It's much the same water. This challenges us to let go of our attachments and our aversions and to find peace not in the absence of waves, which is impossible, but in the way we meet them. As one of my teachers once said, you can't stop the waves, but you can learn to surf. When we embrace this perspective, this ocean of life becomes not a source of consistent suffering, but a vast and beautiful opportunity to further awaken. So that's about crashing waves this morning.